And so I've had a rule in the school garden classes that I've taught over the years is we do not call it dirt, we call it soil. Um, the difference between dirt and soil is that dirt is dead, it has no life in it, and soil is alive. It's full of all sorts of really, really interesting life forms, even though they're really small. They're very interesting and they are very helpful for growing a good garden. So please, we'll talk about it the way it should be, and we'll talk about it as soil. Um, and we tend to think down upon soil. We don't, in our popular cultures, we don't think very much about soil, but I would say that it's in the top three of most underappreciated natural resources that we have, right along with water and plants. And so, um, yeah, moving forward, we're talking about soil here. And if you look back through the course of human history, you'll see that every civilization, every group of people who haven't appreciated their soil have eventually had those civilizations fade out. And in order to make this point, this is a map of Lower Mesopotamia, which is considered by many one of the cradles of civilization and the first place, one of the first places that agriculture began. It's also known as the Fertile Crescent. And so you can see, because I don't believe that those civilizations treated their soil with much respect, they treated it like dirt. You can see what's happened to it. It's desertified and it's become a hard place for those people to live. There's other factors in it as well, but I'd say that's a very large contributing factor. And yeah, every single civilization that's exploited their land has come to decline because the soil is the true ecological capital of any land, and so we can't abuse it. We have to look after it and we have to improve it where we can. And so this is a map of how our soils, the shape our soils are in across the world right now. And you can see most of the map is either very degraded or degraded, and there's very, very few spots on here that is actually in stable, good condition. And then you can see our stats here from the International Solid Waste Association. The world's agricultural land is suffering from moderate to severe degradation, with 10 million hectares of agricultural land being lost every year to soil erosion. And over the past 40 years, 30% of the world's cropland has become unproductive. And so this is what happens to our soil when we treat it like dirt, when we see it as being not valuable at all and not worthy of our consideration and not worthy of our stewardship and our care and our respect. So that's why we're going to try and show some respect to it for once.
Christian, Jack was wondering if you have a link to that.
To these?
Jack, is that what you were referring to?
To this soil degradation map.
Oh yeah, I can share it in the shares in the group shares, if that's
Okay,
all right.
perfect.
Yeah, we'll include it in the email to the participants. But yeah, it's a little bit concerning seeing all those degraded lands, right? And so my point here is that we could keep calling it dirt and continuing along this same sort of pathway or this same kind of journey, keep calling it dirt, and we'll kind of be causing our own problems. The point of studying history, I don't mean to put down any past civilization or anything like that. The point of history isn't to judge anybody. I think the point of history is to learn from our mistakes and to move forward. So we could stop calling it dirt at any time, and we could start thinking of it as like this living, breathing skin of our planet. The planet, which, as far as I know, is the only one that has soil, and it's the only planet that has life on it. So I know correlation isn't causation, but something to consider. And if we really think that soil is so worthless, then I would challenge anybody who's participating live to name a material form of wealth that doesn't ultimately come from the soil, or isn't derived from this, isn't ultimately come from the soil. So if anybody can think of something like that, let me know. But it's going to be hard, because ultimately everything that we hold dear and value ultimately comes from it. And I'd also take this time to point out that the name for our planet, Earth, is a synonym for soil itself, and the name for our species, humans, shares the same prefix as humus, which is the most important part of soil, as we'll see. So I think we've known intuitively how important soil is to us as humans, but we haven't been really practicing it very well as humans. And so let's look at what is soil if we were to just scoop up a bunch of it and measure it by volume. This is what a normal soil would look like. 25% of it, there's lots of water in there in a good soil. There's air pockets in there, and we're going to talk about these two as we go along. But the first thing we're going to focus on is the mineral content of the soil, because that's taken up around 45% of that volume of soil. And then after that, we're going to talk about what this organic matter is in the soil. And so I'm going to start off with the classic soil science perspective. This is, and I'm going to talk about it, try to talk about it quickly, because it is important to understand the physical characteristics of it. But overall, and I don't want to diminish its importance, but as we'll see, as we get into the organic matter side and the biological side, which was largely ignored up until recent times, that is a very important driving factor that we as gardeners need to understand. But classic soil science was a whole bunch of related fields that focus more on like this soluble NPK chemistry of the soil and its physical characteristics. And so within that, they were trying to figure out how did it form, what rocks was it weathered from, was it derived from, and other like physical properties. So we'll see that this is important, but doesn't hold as much meaning as the biological side. So we can think about the soil. The soil is weathered from this parent rock material, and so what that parent rock material is will determine to a considerable extent the nutrient availability and deficiency that will be in the soil that is formed from it. It'll also determine the texture and the structure to a certain point, and its pH. I have these pictures here that I took a screenshot of from this Rocked app, and I really recommend, it's a free download. If anybody wants to look into that, then this is where I got this information. In Banff, They have a lot of limestone, as you can see, and sandstone. They also have some chert. And then as we get into Canmore, this blue band that you see here is lots of sandstone, and we have some shale around. And then as we get into Exshaw and Morley, we get some mudstone. And yeah, so that is the parent rock, the bedrock, which it loosens up over just millennia of wind and rain and all these climatic conditions and biological conditions. And even though you think about rock as being hard, eventually it breaks up into smaller, finer particles, and that is part of the really important part of soil formation. And then another way of classic soil science, understanding soils or like looking at soils, is to study the horizons of the soil. So as the rain falls and trickles down through the horizons of the soil, then different minerals and different materials will sort of get stuck and concentrate at different levels within the soil. And they start to create these zones that we call soil horizons. And so the main thing is like right at the top, that is where most of the organic matter will be, most of the living matter will be. And as you'll have more oxygen up here. And then as you go further and further down into the soil, it will start to be higher mineral content. There'll be less microbial life. There'll be less oxygen there. And then you go down another level and you start to hit some subsoil, which again is mineral, but they're in larger rocks, as we'll see when we talk about texture, until you get all the way down to the bedrock. Another way of describing soil in the classic soil science sort of paradigm is you can learn a couple things about a soil just from looking at the color of it. So for example, if you have like this reddish color here, then it tends to be you have more oxygen in it, and there's higher iron levels, and we know that iron rusts when it's exposed to oxygen. So you can tell a little bit like that. And then you have your darker soils like this that tend to be higher in organic matter. And then you have your soils like this. You'll see a lot of the soils that look at this color around here. They're sort of like this white color, which would indicate leaching, or they're kind of gray, which would indicate that at some point in the past they were anaerobic and they were very compacted and waterlogged. And so when we go back and we kind of like look at where we are in the world and how our soils, as a Bow Valley kind of oriented class, what our soils are like, then it makes a lot of sense to come back and look. And we know that, well, we can see from this slide that the parent material is a lot of like, we know that this area used to be like way back in the day was the bottom of a marine, like a seabed. And so a lot of our soils, you can see microscopic marine organisms, and you know, so we know that in the past, our soils, the rock that our soils are derived from, used to be the bottom of a great sea, until tectonic forces forced them up out of that sea and expose them. And obviously we have our mountain ranges that we can see. And then we also kind of consider, from the point of view of soil horizons, anybody who has seen like a road cut or a side cut of around town where an edge has kind of been eroded off, you can see those horizons in there. and you can see those colors, those white and gray sort of colors, and you can see that our soil horizons, I mean, you could dig a soil pit in your backyard to see exactly what your soil horizons are. But we have a pretty good understanding here in the Rocky Mountains that this first topsoil layer is very, very thin, and we are very quickly running into our subsoil and our weathered rock. And that makes a lot of sense because we know that we were exposed to a lot of glaciation action with, in the last ice age over 10,000 years ago. And that glaciation, as it pushed down from the north, it scraped away all our topsoil and deposited it in the prairies. That's why the prairies have really, really deep, fertile soil, because everything to the north of it was pretty much scraped bare. And we started, as soon as they receded back, we started to build soil again. So we don't have a lot of depth to our topsoil. That is our main limiting factor here in the Rockies in terms of soil building and starting a garden, is that thin layer of topsoil. And then we can also see that we are in a river valley. And as the course of the river has changed through these thousands and thousands of years, that has deposited sand in spaces. And you can see when we talk about the shale, it's more fine-grained sedimentary rock. So there were parts, it just kind of depends on where that river meandered as it kind of evolved, where those deposits of those either fine grains, which tend to settle out in a solution very slowly. So that would be in like a still water area over thousands of years, which just compressed and started to make this rock. And then once it gets exposed again, then it starts to weather away into that fine grain material. And yeah, so. And then it also makes sense that if our soils are more gray, then yeah, of course, it was in a river valley. So there's like these long periods of being underwater. So it would be anaerobic, lacking oxygen. And it also makes sense to consider that we would have these colors because they were compacted and created anaerobic conditions due to the massive weight of the glaciers that were moving overhead. So all that, it's kind of like a long story, and it's outside the scope of this class, but it does have some impact on our soils, and therefore the nutrients that are available or in a deficient form in our soils. The next way of describing soils is to describe its texture. And when we talk about texture, we're talking about the size of the individual soil particles that we have within the soil. So if you have a sandy soil, then the impact that that'll have on your garden is that because the sand particles are quite bigger than the silt and the clay, then there will be bigger gaps in between each one of those particles. And so you tend to have better porosity, and better porosity means that you have good gaseous exchange. And having good gaseous exchange is a very, very important thing about soil, having healthy soil conditions. When we have our living organisms in the soil that are breathing in oxygen and they're breathing out carbon dioxide, if they are breathing out that carbon dioxide and that air starts to get stale, then the water in the soil and that carbon dioxide will combine, and it'll create something called, oh no, did I forget it? Carbonic acid. Oh, I almost forgot that. carbonic acid will be created in those stale, wet environments. So when a good rainfall event happens or a good irrigation event happens, the movement of that gravitational water through the soil, it pushes out that stale air and it brings in fresh oxygen again. And we don't want carbonic acid in our soils because that is not healthy conditions for your roots, your plant roots to be growing into. So a sandy soil with its good porosity will have that really good gaseous exchange. They won't get boggy and puddly. It'll just drain right through. So those are all positives. And then because there's more airspace down in a sandy soil, it'll warm up sooner in the spring. So that's a very good thing for us here in our cool climate, is if our soils can warm up sooner. But on the negative side of that, because sand is so big, it doesn't hold on to nutrients or water really well. It doesn't have very good cation exchange capacity. And that is in contrast to clay particles. So let me flip one slide ahead, and I think I have to explain cation exchange capacity so that you understand this. So at a certain threshold, as you get into the microscopic world, pretty much everything tends to carry a charge to it, whether it's positive or negative. Anything with a charge is called an ion. Anything with a positive charge is an anion, and then anything with a positive charge is a cation. And so if we look over here, there are a number of essential plant nutrients that are available or present in the soil in a positive form. So you can see calcium, potassium, sodium, magnesium, iron, and nitrogen when it's in the ammonium form. Whereas some of the really important plant nutrients will be present in the soil with a negative charge, which is chlorine, nitrogen when it's the nitrate, sulfate, and phosphate. And so when we have good cation exchange capacity in our soil, that means that these clay particles, they're so small that they have this negative cation exchange site, and so they attract the positively charged nutrients, and so those positively charged nutrients stay in the soil and they don't get washed out the same way as these negatively charged nutrients. And so that's why these ones will tend to be the ones that are in limited supply in a soil because they have that charge. And so if your soil has good cation exchange capacity, it tends to be more fertile because it has this property to it. Now flicking back, so having clay in your soil can be a benefit because it keeps those positively charged nutrients that are really, really important for plant growth in the soil, and they don't get leached out of the soil. But on the other side of that, even though this is really, really good thing to have, a clayey soil will be low in porosity because you can see, we can't even see them with the naked eye. They're so small that when they get compacted next to each other, there isn't very much air space there, and there isn't much space for that gaseous exchange, therefore, and they also tend to get really bogged up. And so they get, when you get a good rainfall with the clay soil, then it stays really, really wet, almost to the point where it's, or it can totally be to the point where it creates anaerobic conditions, and that can create those carbonic acid situations, which really aren't good. And then another negative is that because there's not a lot of airspace or porosity, it takes longer for a clay soil to warm up in the spring. And then in between we have our silt, which has a little bit of cation exchange capacity, but not quite as much as clay. It has better porosity like the sand, but not quite as good. And yeah, so it's right in between. But the thing about any soil is that you're not going to just have pure sand. You're not just going to have pure silt or pure clay. It's going to be a mix of the three at some point. And so when you have the three of them mixed in together, which is pretty much always, it's some form of a loam. And if we were to get the perfect mix between sand, silt, and clay, then we could enjoy the benefits of having all the benefits of this and all the benefits of clay in the same kind of soil. So if you were to want to check what the soil texture is of your soil, then the idea is to go out and to basically dig down about 6 inches down into your soil with a trowel. Take it back home, put it in a plastic bag or something, and mash it up, like break up all the clods. And so you just get all the fine grain. So they're all just in particle form. And then you would put into a mason jar like this with water. And for some reason, they recommend using a water softener. And then you just take it and you shake the living bejesus out of it for a couple minutes. And then after that, you just let it sit down, you put it out of the light, and you let those particles settle out. And over time, because the sand is the biggest particle, that'll be the first one to settle out in your jar. And then a little bit later, because the silt is lighter, but it's still bigger than the clay, then you'll start to get a band of the silt that starts to form. And then it'll take, maybe like a week or so before that clay, which is really, really light and stays in suspension in that liquid, eventually that'll start to settle out. And you can look at the jar after a couple of weeks if you haven't disturbed it at all. And you can see the different bands of these soil particles, these different textures, and you can kind of compare. You can start to get to see where you are on this sort of triangular graph in terms of sandy soil, silty soil, or clayey soil, or hopefully it's a nice perfect loam. But some people make the mistake, if they have a very clayey soil, then they think it's a good idea to add sand. And I would caution against this because sand and clay are two of the main ingredients for concrete. And we don't want to make concrete. If you were to mix in sand with clay, then the little tiny clay particles would just fill in those gaps between the bigger sand particles, and you wouldn't be really improving your soil texture. You'd actually be making it worse. So if you want to change the texture of your soil, it's always best to buffer with organic matter, and we'll talk more about that. Next, does anybody have any questions about that?
I don't see any right now.
Okay, so we're almost through the boring part of the soil talk. Okay, but you have to go through this part first because it's the physical characteristics, and it kind of it'll put the rest of it into perspective. So when we look at texture, we're really looking at soil particles, but very rarely you should have soil that's just all a bunch of particles. Once they start to form up together into clods, it's what we call aggregates. And these aggregates that form, they are basically what soil structure is. And soil structure is one of the most important things of understanding how to create healthy conditions for your plant roots. And so this is the old way of kind of looking at what soil structure was. The idea was that like all these different kind of mineral particles had different microscopic shapes, and the way they fit together would impact the soil structure. But I'm just trying to talk about this right here because it was thought to drive soil structure. But as we'll see, I'm going to explain as we move along why this is antiquated and why the biological side of understanding soil is so important. And then I don't have to talk about pH. We talked about that last class, so we'll pass off on this one. And so now we're getting to the good stuff. So we looked at what is soil, and we've covered the mineral side of it. And we left out this organic matter side. And so if we were to take that 5% of the soil and look at what that is by volume, then generally speaking, 80% of that is something called humus, which I'm going to explain in several slides. And then the other 20% is made up of living organisms and plant material. So let's look at what those are first before we talk about humus. So that plant material, it's some of that by volume would be plant roots, and then some of that would be the detritus layer of the soil. So any healthy forest ecosystem, you are going to find like deadfall, dead vegetation that's just resting on top of the soil. And that's what we call detritus. So that makes up the plant portion of that pie chart. Don't think I need to explain that too much more. It's pretty intuitive. And then for that other part of the organic matter in the soil, though that living organism portion of it, we're looking at the soil food web. And so the next couple slides is me talking about the soil food web. And at the start, at the top of the soil food web are the plants. They are the primary producers. They are the autotrophs. They can make their own energy from sunlight energy, water through their roots, and carbon dioxide breathed in through their stomata. And we talked about this before. Not only do they feed this soil food web with their dead plant material that rests on the soil surface as detritus, and that feeds our decomposers. But we also talked about how healthy plants and healthy soils will give off exudates through the root system. And so they are in control of this. They can change what kind of exudates they give off throughout the year and as the ecosystem progresses, as we'll see. But I'm pretty sure everybody in this class can agree. I've talked quite a bit about plants already, so let's move on to the soil food web. And so that second trophic level of soil food web characters, one of the main players in it is bacteria. And bacteria is known as a prokaryote, which means it has no nucleus. Pro is in before and karyote is in the kernel. That's kind of the etymology of it. There are face-meltingly large amounts of biodiversity in terms of bacteria, and they're super, super small. Apparently so small that probably about over 500,000 individual bacteria organisms could fit in this little dot in the punctuation mark. So super, super small, but they exist in amazing diversity and just incredible volume in terms of amounts in small spaces. There's a couple different kinds of classifications for them. We know them mostly as the decomposers. They specialize in breaking down soft green materials, as we'll talk about later. They secrete really powerful enzymes, and some are specialists. They'll take out important nutrients from molecules and absorb them themselves, and some of them are generalists that'll just go and kind of break down dead organic material and absorb it in. But they do really well at breaking down soft green fresh materials. And then there are mutualist bacteria. These are the nitrogen fixers that we talked about, phosphorus solubilizers. So there are bacteria that can be very specialized, and they will trade in their specialties to the plants in order to get some of those sugary exudates that they give off. And then, yeah, you got your exudate feeders in that root zone, that rhizosphere area around the roots. Another way of characterizing them, which I will from now on, is that some bacteria are aerobes. They're aerobic, so that means they need oxygen to live. And those are the healthy conditions that we want. We want to work with the bacteria that are aerobic rather than the anaerobic bacteria. These are the ones that can live in very, very low oxygen or no oxygen conditions. And these tend to be the ones that'll create diseases. So we want to make sure that the conditions that we create in our soil always have oxygen in them. And then there are some bacteria that are facultative, so they can survive in both anaerobic or aerobic conditions. They come in different shapes, as you can see over here. Another important thing to know about them, just on this quick rundown, is that they secrete a very sticky kind of biofilm, and that is a way for them to not get washed through the soil when there's a big rainfall event. So that is going to come up later, so I had to mention that here. And then something really interesting that they do is they have this ability for horizontal gene transfer. And so we tend to think about evolution as being vertical, as in genes being passed down to the next generation through sexual reproduction. But bacteria have this really crazy ability. They can swap genes with their neighbors, like their trading cards, and evolve that way. So interesting behavior. Another really, really interesting behavior about bacteria, and I recommend you look up this TED Talk by this woman, Bonnie Basler. She knocks it out the park in this talk. And she and her team, I think Princeton was where she's from, her research team, they found that bacteria are actually able to, somewhat very, very primitively, but they're able to communicate with each other. They can tell how many of their own species are present in an area around them, and they can tell how many of the different species of bacteria are around them. It's kind of like the synaptic gaps in our brains. They send neurochemical signals across the synaptic gap, which is like a lock and key sort of system. It's very, very similar to that. That's how they're communicating with each other. I'll let Bonnie explain more for you if you're interested in that. But yeah, it's kind of cool how they're able to sense how many of their own species that are around and how many of other species are within that aqueous solution. And the other member of that second trophic level of the soil food web is the fungi. And fungi, most people think about fungi as being mushrooms, but mushrooms are just the reproductive organ of a fungi. The true body of a fungi will radiate down into the soil, and it has these, they kind of look like spider webs, sort of. Yeah, I kind of think of them as kind of really wispy spider web like structures. Obviously, this is growing on wood. They, as a decomposer, they specialize in breaking down like really tougher materials, whereas the bacteria is able to break down the soft green, soft materials. Then the fungi, they specialize in breaking down the tougher materials like wood. They can even go down and they secrete this really powerful acid that's able to basically break down rocks and grab the mineral nutrients out of the rocks that they need. And the terminology for this is like a single thread, a single strand of this fungi would be called a hyphae. But once they start to bundle up into these visible forms, then we would start to refer them as the mycelium. And just for some perspective of how small they are, it would take 100,000 hyphae in order to reach the same diameter as a human hair. So once we start to see them in these bundles, there is a lot of this fungal mycelium present. And so even in just like a small 1 teaspoon of good garden soil, we'll have several yards of fungal hyphae just because they're so thin. And there are a lot of really economically important fungi out there, whether they be gourmet mushrooms or whether they are medicinal value. There are some fungi that are able to bioremediate oil spills. Yeah, so there's a lot of really important, economically important fungi out there. But I think it's interesting to consider that they're really hard to culture in a lab. Once you take them out of their natural environment, they don't grow. And so they're really hard for mycologists to study. Mycologist being the term of a fungi scientist. And so we know of around 100,000 species of fungi, but some experts think that the total amount of different species, the total diversity of species of fungi ranges up into the millions. So for all the really important fungi that we're already aware of, we really only know about 10% of all the fungi species. So what other amazing species are out there that could have enormous value to humans? And what are things, the fungi that are doing important stuff that are just important for the entire ecosystem? And then moving into the next trophic level here, we have the protozoa. These are eukaryotes. So fungi was also a eukaryote. That means, it means the true kernel. It means they have a nucleus in them. So these are becoming more and more similar to the cells that we have in our body. There's about 60,000 known species. They can't make their own food like plants, which are autotrophs. Decomposers would be chemotrophs. These ones are heterotrophs. So these ones have to go out and look for their food. They eat mostly bacteria, but there are some species that'll feed on fungi and some that'll feed on other protozoa. And an average protozoan can eat about 10,000 bacteria a day. So they're good at going out and grazing on those bacteria that are attracted to those root zones. But I still, like, I don't have enough time to really explain how intricate and interconnected the soil food web is in terms of how complex all these different species within each of the classifications are in terms of eating each other. But this is just a little introduction. Yeah, so there's three main classifications for protozoa. This is the pseudopods, which kind of lumber through the soil or through an aqueous solution by kind of pushing out and moving really awkwardly through the soil. And then there's the flagellates that have this whip-like structure that they use to move around and capture the things they're going to eat. And then you have the ciliates, and this doesn't show it all that well, but it's just kind of fuzzy right along the cell membrane. They have lots of these little tiny little hairs that are sort of comparable to like a Roman war galley with all the rowing paddles out the side, and they move around the soil pretty quickly. They can also create currents in the aqueous solution in order to encourage the bacteria into their mouths. Yeah, and so I wish I could talk more about these organisms, but this is a really, really great YouTube channel that I recommend you looking up. The microscopy work that they do in this is really, really stunning. And the narrations that Hank Green do in it are really, really great. Just watching a couple episodes of this, really interesting and should really start to pique your curiosity about what's going on in this microcosmos that we are not able to see with our own eyes. Oh, no. We're not going to watch that. And then we'll run down the rest of the cast of characters. We have our nematodes up here, which are microscopic roundworms. And there's about 20,000 different known species, and they are in this trophic level. They like to feed on bacteria, some of the fungi. They'll graze on protozoa. Some of them will eat other nematodes. Some of them will be problematic for gardeners in terms of being root feeders, but then some of them will be eaten by these predatory nematodes. They're really cool. They can act as a taxi service for like bacteria or protozoa to help them get through the soil. The next group is the microarthropods and the macroarthropods. These are a very wide group of flies and beetles and spiders. And we also see this one is a springtail, and then we have another one down here that's a mite. A lot of them are considered shredders, so they break down a lot of that detritus layer, open it up and allow it to be broken down even faster by the bacteria and the fungi. But again, these are all members. Everything in here is eating each other, and there's just like these really complex food webs going on. That's the main point to get out of this. And then almost lastly, but definitely not least important, is our earthworms. And earthworms will graze on decomposers. A lot of people think of earthworms as the decomposers themselves, but they're actually attracted to like the cytoplasm in bacteria. It's very nutrient rich. And so some people think that the worms might eat the roots of their plants, but worms are just, their ecological role is to go out and to feed on the on those decomposers, and they accelerate the decomposition very, very to a large degree. They don't have teeth like us. They have like a gizzard like chickens. And so they have this grit in their gizzard that as they go through the soil and they eat, so there could be like a piece of maybe like a tiny little piece of apple that's on the ground and it's covered with the bacteria, then that attracts the worm, which is vastly much bigger than the bacteria. It'll take a bite as it goes for the bacteria, it'll take a bite out of the apple as well, and that opens up more surface area for more decomposers to break it down quickly. Yeah, very, very powerful gizzards. We tend to think of, like, you might think that an alligator or crocodile has like a really strong bite, but apparently their pounds of pressure per square inch for a crocodile might be around 4,000 pounds pressure per square inch, whereas worms can exert with their gizzard in order to break down that material can exert 8,000 to 9,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. So they're really, really powerful in this regard. And we think about worms as being dirty and not healthy. But because they have so much pressure in their gizzard, they actually clean the soil to a very, very impressive degree. There was a study about worms, or they fed a worm bin some cow manure, which was very high in E. coli and salmonella and these organisms, these pathogens that would make us sick. And within 48 to 72 hours, because of the worms being such powerful gizzards, and they also have a very healthy biofilm on their outside, they reduced the pathogens by 99.9%. So we think of them as being kind of gross and unhealthy, and you won't want to touch them, but they're actually playing this really cool role of cleaning our natural systems and making them healthy and free of pathogens for us again. I also, maybe I should have said it later, like, people tend not to like soil. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it reminds people, you know, of our own, you know, mortality. We're all going to return to the soil at some point. Maybe it makes them think about, you know, our waste products is what turns into soil eventually. But I think it's kind of cool that soil is the true place of alchemy for life. It is the medium where death turns into life again. And if you look at it that way, maybe people won't hate on soil as much. And then obviously we have some birds that would eat the earthworms, and we have some mammals like some hedgehogs and some moles that live in the soil, or field mice, you know, so they're part of the soil food web as well. Anybody have questions? Good.
You're good to go.
Okay, sweet. Well, thank you for letting me get through all that. I know that was a bit of a push, but the whole point of explaining all those cast of characters that are present in the soil, and there are so many of them below the soil that we don't see, but why do the question that we want to ask ourselves is, why do plants give away those hard-earned sugars to the soil food web? I mentioned in the first class that those exudates they push down through their roots and they secrete and give away, they give away a lot of sugars, sometimes up to 30% of all the sugars that they create, they're giving away to the soil food web. And so what are the benefits that plants get in return? And that's why This is why it was so important to talk about all this. So when they're giving away those sugars, they attract so many bacteria and fungi all around their root system that the competition for space in order to even get close to that root system can be really difficult. So if you were a disease-causing microbe and you're trying to infect and you're trying to gain sustenance or you know, in order to be a parasite on that plant, the plants, by giving away these exudates to all these other microorganisms, create almost like a physical barrier where it's hard for those disease-causing microbes to even gain purchase. And it's also kind of the reason why I wanted to bring up that talk by Bonnie Bassler, because if these microbes have this really primitive way of communicating with each other, knowing how many of them are present and how many of all the other organisms are present, then the point that she makes is that oftentimes if the parasitic or the pathogen disease-causing microbe is so overwhelmed by all the other species, then they won't launch an attack. They won't even affect the plant from that point of view. So it creates really healthy conditions there for plant roots. And then there's just like this idea of hyperpredation, where there's all this complexity of all these organisms eating each other in this space. It makes it really, really hard for one of these disease-causing organisms to grow to a big enough population number in order to launch that attack. And I think you might remember from the first class where we saw that picture of the tomato root and the fungal hyphae strand that tricked the root-feeding nematode into coming because it was pretending like it was a weak plant, and then it attacked it and it started to harvest its nutrients, you know. So those are examples of this hyperpredation that happens when you have a very vibrant soil food web going on around your plants. And then there's also this idea of antibiosis. I'm not, I'll attach this in the notes, but this is a really cool video by Cornell University that shows how the beneficial microbes that can be found in really good compost, they have this ability to they basically confuse disease-causing organisms that are trying to locate their hosts through this thing called, this technique called chemotaxis. And so these beneficial microbes are like just kind of sending out these different chemicals into the solution and protecting the plant in this way as well. But we're not going to watch this whole video. You can watch it on your own time, if that's okay. It's good graphics though, right?
Christian, before you move on, Ekaterina had a question about worms. Do earthworms die in the winter? Will they die in the compost pile?
So earthworms, like the night crawlers that we have in this area, they have very extensive burrowing systems. They can burrow down below the frost line and will be very kind of mostly in a dormant state because it's so cold, but that's how they would survive. So if you have a static pile, which I'll talk about in a couple slides, and you had worms in there in the spring and summer, then as the cold weather sets in, then they would dive down and try to evade that cold weather. Okay, so protection from disease is one major benefit that we are able to enjoy when we have very vibrant, alive soils. And then the next one is this concept of nutrient cycling and nutrient retention. And so we've talked about, actually, I think I glossed over the mutualist fungi on that slide, but this is an example of mycorrhizal fungi, which is a mutualist fungi. And so this big, thick structure here, that is actually a very, very small root hair of a plant. And then all these tiny little threads coming off of it, that is the hyphae of the mycorrhizal fungi. And so again, we talked about this in the first class. Plants really good at making those sugars, sending them down, giving them away to these fungi strands that are increasing the surface area of the root substantially. And each one of these strands, as it radiates out into that mineral soil, they are adapted to taking up these mineral nutrients that the plant roots are not adapted to. So all these really, really important nutrients like phosphorus, which gets bound up into the soil, and from a plant's point of view is insoluble, they can't get. Well, the fungi can get it really quite easily with those strong acids. And then, you know, your calcium and your magnesium and water. So this is just an amazing ecosystem service that we get when we work with the soil food web rather than against it. And then the next level of this nutrient cycling and retention is this idea that if the plant roots are giving off these exudates and they're attracting in the fungi and they're attracting in the bacteria, then that brings in the next wave of that trophic level, those consumers that want to eat the bacteria and the fungi. And then those next wave, if they're protozoa or they're nematodes, then there's all these different species that want to eat different protozoa and different nematodes. And you have this, like I said several times, probably too many times now, you have this whole food web going on. And just because they're tiny doesn't mean that they don't have waste streams like us. So when they eat something, they can't absorb all of those nutrients. And some of that comes out in microbial manure, we'll call it. So think about these bacteria as they're gleaning these free sugars from the root system. They don't just have those sugars within the cytoplasm. They have been going out in soil, and they have nitrogen for the protein they need, and they have phosphorus for the membrane that they have. And so they're kind of like these tiny little bags of fertilizer. And so what ends up happening is you have this constant stream of nutrient cycling all around the root system. So this is just like a really amazing, smart strategy for plants to use is, yeah, we give away some extra sugars that we're really good at making ourselves. But by doing that, we're creating like this constant stream of soluble nutrients that we need and aren't as good at getting as the rest of these organisms that surround me. And then whatever the plants aren't able to take up when they're available. So I guess the distinction I have to explain here is that a nutrient, when it is insoluble, is contained within, it's either bound up as a mineral in the soil and can't move, or it's bound up within the biomass of a bacteria or a protozoa. And so, and then no, that's insoluble. Now, the soluble nutrients are the nutrients that can be dissolved in water and can be taken up by the plant roots really easily. So as the insoluble nutrients are being made available, the plant roots can take them up, and whatever they can't take up, then another organism is going to come and it's going to capture it. And so this creates a situation where if you have a big rainfall event, you're not losing nutrients from the soil because they're getting washed through. They're in these organisms that are staying there around the root system. So you're going to have more fertile soil in that way. That makes sense to everybody? So I think the best example of this, thanks Lou, the best example of this is if you think about Amazon, like rainforest soils, from the classic soil science point of view, where you're measuring soluble nutrients in the soil, rainforest soils are considered very poor in nutrients. And we see this because like in this, as they clear vast swaths of the rainforest for agriculture, it's only a couple years of production that they get before those soils are so nutrient poor that nothing will grow in it. That is actually an incredible waste. But so if we consider the rainforest soils from the classic soil science perspective of just measuring the soluble nutrients, then I guess that makes sense. But if we look at it through the lens of like the biomass and like all these soil food member in that web, then when you're testing soluble NPK, you can't test for all the nutrients that are bound up within those microbes. And so anybody looking at a rainforest, you're not, like, it doesn't make any sense. You can't tell me that those soils are poor in nutrients. Look at how productive those ecosystems are. But because all the nutrients are bound up in this soil food web and the cycling is going on all the time, that's in like that healthy forest conditions, then it's very productive and you're not losing anything to all that rainfall. But when you disturb those conditions and you have basically exposed soil everywhere, then yeah, those soluble nutrients are gone and you don't have any soil life. So I hope that makes sense in the very quick explanation. And so the next slide, so now we've talked about how the soil food web and the biological way of looking at soils helps us with disease control and with nutrient cycling and retention. We have to understand this next part, like soil structure, like I said earlier, is really, really important to the healthy conditions for the roots of your plants. Because we really need that good gaseous exchange. We need that porosity. The bacteria in the soil, like I said, they secrete that biofilm that allows them from getting washed out of the soil. But that biofilm, that stickiness, that's what gets individual soil particles to stay together and to form these aggregates, right? And then also think about the mycelium, those threads, as they radiate through the soil. Those bind up the soil and keep them in the right place. And so they create these larger aggregates. And if we were live right now, I would have a sample from the garden. And when you pick up good garden soil, it'll stay together in your hand in like a big clod. And you'll be able to see like this Swiss cheese kind of structure from all the burrowing action from the worms and all the smaller little organisms that are going through it. But as soon as you put a little bit of pressure on it, it just breaks apart. And it's really, really nice. So this is an advantage from the point of view of a bigger aggregate like that that's held together through these glues and through these threads. That's not going to be picked up in a windstorm and blown halfway across the continent. It's going to stay where it needs to be. And it also creates that breaking apart. It's really easy for it to hold together, but putting a little bit of pressure on it, it gives us really good tilled. Tilled is a term in gardening, is like your soil is easy to work with, and it's good ergonomically for our backs to be working in soils that have good tilled. I guess also from a erosion standpoint, if we have water running over the surface, then those clods will hold together much easier than a fine particle well. They'll be picked up really easily and taken down along with that. And then, yeah, like that burrowing action, that creates, we're not so dependent on the texture of the sand and the way that these particles fit together. We're getting good porosity, which creates the good drainage and good gaseous exchange just through the action of these microbes and the ecosystem service that they do for free. We don't have to do anything really that special. Once we get them established, then they do this for free 24/7, 365. So yeah, all those are just like so important for good garden soil.
Christian?
And
yeah, Katerina had a question. Do you use straw to cover soil for winter?
Katerina, I will get to that in a couple slides. I appreciate your interest in that, but yeah, I can't explain that yet because then that would spoil a couple slides for me. Now, the last really important thing to consider about all this action of the soil food web of this passive decomposition is the formation of this molecule called the humus molecule. And so if you remember that pie graph, like 80% of the organic matter of a soil is humus. Humus is the end product of the decomposition of dead plant or animal material or waste products. If I were to drop, say, an apple core to the soil, then the first things to grow on it would be the bacteria, and maybe some fungi would start to colonize it, and then we'd get all those other trophic levels come in, and we'd have our nematodes and our protozoa eating the bacteria, and then the worm come through and eat the protozoa, and all of these organisms would be getting energy, any leftover energy in that apple core that they can. And then the higher up the trophic levels, they would be trying to get the energy and the nutrients out of the lower trophic levels. And so what humus is like a very, very, very dead molecule. Like it's the end product of decomposition. It doesn't have any nutrient value in of its own. But what makes it special is its amazing amount of surface area that remember when I was talking about cation exchange capacity? It's so small and it has such delicate kind of structures and microsites. It has a lot of cation exchange capacity. So the more humus you have in your soil, then the more water retention you enjoy and the more nutrient retention you enjoy. And yeah, so from a garden fertility point of view, the more humus or the more soil organic matter that you have, those two terms can be pretty much used synonymously, means that you're going to have more fertile soil and you're going to have to water your soil less. It's going to be more efficient with water. And then I kind of have to explain, I've been using the word organic a lot to describe soil. And I worry that some people might just hear the word organic and think that I'm talking about the organic food. But organic food has that label because it's based on farming practices that don't use synthetic man-made chemicals. So it's only using biologically derived inputs. So that's part of the reason why it's called organic food. Anything that's natural or biological has to have carbon in it. That's why I have this little atom up here of carbon. And so basically carbon, in order to understand carbon atom, when we go back and think about that electron sharing that I talked about a couple of classes ago, maybe last class, I can't remember, it's all a blur. If you would remember that an atom to be happy just wants to have 8 electrons in its outside orbital. And so what makes carbon really unique is that because it has 6 atoms, or it has, sorry, 6 electrons, and the first orbital always has 2, then it has 4 on the outside, and that makes it very, very malleable and open to accepting relationships with other atoms and sharing electrons. And so that's what's made it really basically hard for scientists to imagine life without carbon in it. And so basically any natural biological life form has carbon in it. Any chemist, if you use the word organic, it refers to something that has carbon in it, not the food label. Does that make sense, Lou? Okay. So that's what I'm trying to say here is that the humus molecule has a lot. It's a long chain carbon molecule. It has a lot of carbon in it. And what makes this important from our point of view is that the more carbon that we have in our soil, because we have more humus in our soil, that is where carbon should be. We tend to think about carbon, when we think about carbon dioxide, as being this evil driver of climate change. We have too much of it in the atmosphere. But if we go back, if we were to think back of that soil degradation map that I had before, all those soils that are degraded are very, very low in humus, very, very low in soil organic matter, okay? So we have 2 huge problems. We have soil degradation, which is affecting our land's ability throughout the world to hold nutrients and to hold water, and therefore they're making worse and worse agricultural food production lands. And then on the other side, we have way too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And then in the middle of it, we have these things called plants that are really good at making these simple sugars, these simple carbon sugars, and using them as energy and turning them into their own biomass, you know? So what I'm trying to say here is that we, as a species, as human beings, we just need to start building soil at massive rates, and those problems will solve themselves. I mean, that's not the only tool that we would have at our disposal, but it seems to me like it's the best tool. It's the most time-tested thing that we could do. For every 1% of carbon that we build into our soils, which is currently, I think the average amount of carbon in our soil is around 3%, and we could get them up as high as 15%. But for every 1% of carbon that we add to a soil, then it can hold 144,000 liters of water per acre. Okay, so one of the big things about climate change is that as atmospheric temperatures become warmer, then it holds more moisture in our atmosphere. And so our flood drought cycles are going to become more extreme. And so if we can, this is going to make growing food for ourselves much harder if we're going to have floods and droughts in more extremes, you know. So if we can hold more water in our landscape for longer times, make that available for plants to grow longer, then that's going to be very, very helpful. And then for every 1 ton of soil that we build, we sequester 3 tons of carbon dioxide out of the air. So, I mean, there's all this crazy technology about like liquefying carbon dioxide and injecting it below the ocean and building synthetic forests and all that. But I really think that this is the best tool. This is why the UN Food and Agriculture organization says that small scale, diversified agroecologies that build soil is one of the best tools that we have available as humanity of mitigating climate change. And I think is awesome too, from the standpoint of we can fix climate change, or we can make a really good step towards mitigating climate change by building soils. And the better the soils we have, then the better food we have. And I like delicious food. So let's do that. Any questions on that? No, kind of getting off track from small scale gardening there, but I think it's a very important point to bring up. How's my time? Okay, I'm at an hour. Bring it home. So this is actually just kind of like a trick question, I'll admit it. Well, like so we're transitioning right now from the importance of the soil food web. Now I think that's pretty well established to like, okay, what can we do in order to work with the soil food web and to build healthy soils? So kind of a trick question, but does anybody want to answer, what does soil look like? No, that's okay. I already said it's a trick question. Well, what should it look like? Also a trick question. Because the answer to this is that we shouldn't actually see it. And that was Katerina that was going to spoil that, Katerina. So if you look at any healthy ecosystem, we don't see the soil. We see the perennial vegetation. We see that detritus layer that's covering the soil. And so that is what soil should look like. We shouldn't even see it. But if you think about our main ways of producing food is we plow and disturb that soil to a very great degree. And we expose it to the elements. And so even though that is what soil should look like, this is what we do over and over and over again. And why would we want to mimic a desert when we could mimic a forest floor? Which ecosystem looks more healthy to you? Which ecosystem looks more life-giving and diversity boosting, to expose soil or to cover it up? And so, yeah, so I try to mulch soil as much as I can. I try to never leave it exposed to those elements. And so, yeah, mulching is a very important thing. I'll talk more about it in one of the next classes. But those beneficial soil microbes are very sensitive to ultraviolet light. If you think about in a rainstorm, when the power of that, it might look like a small raindrop, but the power of that raindrop when it hits bare soil can really, really readily carry away the clay and the organic matter. Remember when I talked about the jar test? And the last things to settle would be the clay and the organic matter on top. Well, those are the things that hold water in our garden the best. And the things that settle the first are the sand. Those are the parts of the soil that drain it away the fastest. So having mulch and replicating that forest ecosystem detritus layer is very important. It doesn't always work, and I'll explain that in a future class, but I think it's really important to try our best to cover soil, because that's how nature intended it to do. And also, if you think about weeds, the opportunists, when we leave exposed soil, then a lot of those opportunist pioneering species, they're just reacting to lots of light, you know, whereas if we cover the soil and they don't have the light conditions to germinate, then we reduce our weed pressure issues. This is a really extreme version of mulching. I've never mulched to that degree, but yeah, we'll talk more about it. And also, I want to make people aware of, if you're considering using straw as one of the options to mulch your soil, there's a fairly new product on the market called a persistent herbicide, and it is marketed to grass growers, to pasture land growers. They're growing grasses, and they're trying to control broadleaf herbs. And so traditionally, they would get sprayed with a normal herbicide in order to control those broadleaf herbs. But this new persistent herbicide is being marketed as something that you only have to spray every couple years. And so that's fine in that scenario, I guess. Not really, but some people might buy straw from a farmer who's using a persistent herbicide without being aware of that, and then you use the straw on your own garden where you're basically growing broadleaf herbs, and that herbicide is going to stifle growth in your garden. And once it starts to get in your soil, because it's persistent, it'll take, you know, upwards to 8 or 10 years before it'll start to degrade, whereas the more traditional herbicides degrade fairly rapidly, like within a year. So that could be a big mistake just to look out for.
Christian, got a question here from Katerina again. I read that it's not recommended to disturb the soil. Oh, you might be getting to this. How do you add compost? Do you mix it with the rest of the soil and therefore disturbing it, or do you put it on the top?
Yeah, I will explain that more, but yeah, I like to mix it in just very, very superficially on the top. Yeah, think back to that soil horizon slide where you saw that top layer was that organic matter rich. That's where most of the oxygen was, all that. And as you go down, it's more mineral rich. Also consider, when you're adding compost, if you were to mix it deep down into the soil, then plants have evolved with soil horizons for thousands and thousands of years. So they are already kind of programmed. They know where to send their roots to the proper horizons in order to find what they need. So if we start messing with it and start flipping all the horizons around, then that's not necessarily a good thing from a plant point of view. But yeah, I was about to kind of talk about that. And I'll talk more about the tools that I use in next class to explain how I prep a bed in order to create favorable conditions, but not to over disturb the soil and yeah, we'll talk more about that. Very good questions.
There's another one, Christian, and you might get to this. You can put this one off if you want. When filling up planters, do these kinds of layers still apply?
Nah, not so much. Not in filling up a planter, yeah, maybe you would add like a more subsoily down on the bottom, but mostly it's just topsoil and then compost on top. Okay, yeah, so we want to continue to kind of look at how we can work with nature rather than against it. So we want to minimize soil disturbances as best we can. Um, One of the traditional ways of gardening would be to do a double dig, which is digging quite deep down and mixing all the soil up. And then another way would be that was very popular in the past is to take a big rototiller, which goes quite deep and it basically blends up the soil. And so what happens there, like I know people, the idea was that you're kind of mixing in this compost and it's going to be nice and easy for the roots to get down and all this stuff. But really what you're doing is you're basically taking all that really great soil structure and you're just busting it into all these individual particles. So that is not so good. I'll explain how to get around that. And then also consider like all those really great fungal mycelium strands that are able to create beneficial relationships with your plants. You're putting that in a blender too, and that's just gone. Doing that once every couple years isn't such a bad thing, but it's when you start to do it unthinkingly and just chronically, you're gonna degrade the quality of your soil structure and create unfavorable conditions for some of those most important soil food web members. Another way of not working with the soil food web is to overuse synthetic fertilizers. Synthetic fertilizers are salts so that they dissolve in water. And so if you apply a salt to like a dissolved salt to your soil and you have these single cell organisms with semi-permeable membranes, that salt content can be so great that it kills, it creates this osmotic shock that can kill the bacteria, like the simpler organisms in the soil. And if you start killing off the bacteria in your soil, then what's the protozoa and the nematode and the earthworms gonna eat, So you're undercutting the diet of the rest of the soil food web when you overuse synthetic fertilizers. And then it's also kind of shown that a lot of those mutualistic relationships that are so great, if a plant root is just swimming in synthetic fertilizers that's so easy for them to take up, then they'll stop giving away those exudates to feed the soil food web, which might not seem like a big deal because like, okay, well, we're applying the nutrients. But what happens when not only are you losing that soil, the nutrient sort of search parties that they offer, but here's this picture of this really, really valuable Arthrobotrys dactyloides, this fungal hyphae that's protecting the plant from a root-feeding nematode. And what happens to that protective glove around the plant root that's protecting you from all these disease-causing organisms? Now all of a sudden that's gone, and now you're more susceptible to disease. And now because you're more susceptible to these diseases, you're going to start using more of these biocides. And now not only are you spending extra money on the fertilizer, but now you're spending extra money on the biocides. And the biocides don't just kill the pests in your garden, they kill the beneficials too. And once they're gone, then you inherit their work. And so it turns into like this feedback loop that technically it's called a positive feedback loop, but it's hard to call it that. I honestly wish there was a better metaphor or analogy to use, but it's kind of like a crack addiction. Once you start using and abusing these synthetic fertilizers and biocides, you have to use more and more in order to get the same effect. And the more you use, the more it degrades conditions, means you need to use more, and you're spending more money and you're doing more work. Whereas if you had just worked with the soil food web to begin with, they were doing these for basically for free. So that's important to understand. So how do we build soil? Not just how do we not undercut those soil building things, but how do we build soil? And so the most familiar form of composting is your home scale, what we would call static composting, because we're just kind of putting it in a pile and we're letting those decomposers break it down quite slowly, but compost does happen. It works. All you need is enough moisture and those bacteria and fungi will do their thing. The negative about this is that it doesn't warm up enough. As you'll see with the next slide with thermophilic composting, in this static style, it doesn't warm up, it doesn't heat up the pile. And so that doesn't, if you put any opportunists, any weed species in there that have gotten to the seed or flower stage, then you're kind of creating more work for yourself down the road, and it doesn't heat up enough to kill any pathogens. I guess the other thing I'd have to point out about this, given that we're in the Bow Valley, is that this is against the bylaws right now. We're not allowed to compost like this outdoors. It is considered a wildlife attractant, or it could potentially attract dangerous wildlife, to quote the bylaw exactly. And so I totally recognize this, but I really wish that we could trial. I have this idea of welding rebar, like making rebar cages that would be wildlife proof, and we could still compost in a static way like this, but it would operate the same way as our bear bins. If a wildlife can't get in there because it's structurally strong enough, they don't get any positive behavioral reinforcement. You know, so I wish that we could consider as a community at least trying like welding a couple of those together, throwing a bunch of food scraps in there and putting them with some trail cameras to see how well they work. And yeah, it just seems like the same thing. I mean, bear bins, bears and wildlife, they can smell the contents, but they can't get in there, you know, and so a welded up composting static pile would essentially be the same thing. I'd be interested to see how that works out. But as it stands, we're not technically allowed to do this. And then the next style for composting for soil building is the thermophilic way of doing it. And so in order to really understand composting and soil building, there's this idea of green material and brown material. And a green material is a material that it's like a waste product, an organic waste product that is relatively high in nitrogen compared to carbon. So you'll always see that there's more carbon than nitrogen in each one of these ratios, but a fresh green material, which the bacteria are really good at breaking down, like I said before. And then you have your brown materials that you can see, like wood chips, are 700 to 1. So in order to create a good thermophilic compost pile, you would layer high green materials, basically higher in nitrogen, but still quite high in carbon. And then you'd layer some high carbon materials, and you just kind of lasagna those ingredients, whatever you have together. And that actually, it creates a feeding frenzy. If you layer it correctly and it has the right kind of moisture to it, it creates so much microbial activity. They just go in this feeding frenzy that it actually heats up and you want to aim to get it around 55 degrees to 60 degrees Celsius. And that is the perfect temperature that would kill any weed seeds that are in there. It would kill any pathogens that are in there. And it just creates a really, really high quality product. You have to turn them every couple days because the middle of the pile will start to go anaerobic, which again, we never want to create anaerobic conditions in our gardens or our compost. So you have to kind of pile them, but it works really, really well. You can create really good compost within 6 weeks.
Christian, question here from Ekaterina again. Can you make food compost with bokashi on your balcony?
Can I make food compost? So I've used the bokashi before, and it is actually an anaerobic process. It's kind of like fermenting it. You use a special kind of brewer's yeast. And so it is, I wouldn't call it compost because compost by definition has to be aerobic. So a bokashi is anaerobic, but it does break down those materials. What I really didn't like about the bokashi is that before you can use it, first of all, you do the bokashi cycle, and then you have to bury it underground a couple feet below the ground for it to go aerobic again. Like I said about our soil horizons, our soil profiles, we can't dig that deep in the Canadian Rockies, so bokashi, it works, but I don't know if it's really works that well for our context, because in order to use it, you have to let it kind of settle or like go aerobic again in the soil by burying it in the, I don't know. You could do it, but I'm not a big fan of it for that reason, if that makes sense. But I am a huge fan of vermicomposting. So vermicomposting, rather than using earthworms, you use tropical redworms, and they are more adapted to, they don't need to burrow down. They stay high up in very high organic matter conditions. They reproduce really quickly. They do all these things that are really perfect for that context. And it makes sense for our context because you can do that indoors. If you do it the right way, there's no smell for you as the homeowner. You're doing it indoors, so it's not considered a wildlife attraction. Things you got to watch out with how much you feed them and what you feed them, but I think this is a great way to build really, really great soil amendments here in the Rockies in our generally small house and condo contexts. And then this is a picture. This is what we have basically at the golf course with our worm thing that we set up with the Canmore Golf and Curling Club. The idea is that we feed on top, and the worms will always go to the top because they want to eat the decomposing bacteria and fungi. And then there's a breaker harvesting bar that pushes the material down below. It's a pretty sweet system.
Christian, I think you were wanting to elaborate on a question that Francine had a couple classes ago.
Is Francine here?
She's not here today, but
okay.
We'll watch the recording.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. So, but I can't really remember what her question was. It was like, we were talking about potassium, and banana peels are higher in potassium. So I think she was asking if like you can fertilize with banana peels. And it reminded me of when I was in Nicaragua, my friend Brock told me about this fertilizer that they use called stank juice. My buddy Brock, this guy, he was from Louisiana, and he had his own farm. and he showed us this technique where we actually took down, we took banana leaves and we took a whole bunch of plant waste materials and we put it in a bucket and we basically mashed the living bejesus out of it. And so it was kind of like sitting in its own juices. And he's like, we leave this for like 2 or 3 days and let it ferment a bit. And then they'll poke holes in the bottom of the bucket, and they'll hang it on a tree or something like that. And it will drip the stank juice down into the root system. And it obviously, by the name of it, it kind of smells. And again, we kind of had like this, not an argument, but a debate over whether it was a good idea, because we don't really want to use anaerobic microorganisms around our plant roots, because that very intense enzymes and acids and all that stuff. And then we have our anaerobic bacteria. But he said, based on his experience, it worked really well. So that was like, that's what it made me think of, is the stank juice. Like, obviously there's going to be soluble nutrients in that anaerobic, but I just think it kind of exposes you to disease creating conditions.
A quick question.
Yeah.
So where, if you were going to do with worms, where do you get the worms?
You might want to talk to Reed Salden at the Canmore Golf and Curling Club, because we got a lot of worms over there. I don't know if he was able to build the right the way of getting the worms out. It's kind of like a trommel that you would need to sell at a level like that. But it might be worth asking around at the golf course. Otherwise, I recommend my friend Dan Rollinson from Coaldale. He has a business called Earthly Matters that he will sell composting worms. I think it's around $50 a pound. So a little bit on the expensive side, but once you have them, they will reproduce quite fast.
Yeah, because I was kind of just Googling, and you can either build or you can buy, the size of a chest or a coffee table kind of composters that use worms in them. And you can put that, that would be legal to put in your garage, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
yeah. Or garage. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're tropical worms, so they will decompose. They'll drive that decomposition faster when the temperatures are around 22 to 25 degrees Celsius. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you put it out in your shed and it gets cool, then they won't be decomposing as fast. But the way we got around this with the golf course, we just have them in a sea can, and we put a soil heating cable along the top, and then Reed had these insulated tarps we put over top of it. And so we were kind of worried the first winter season that they might not survive, but they actually proliferated. So you can kind of MacGyver up a system to work over the winter in cooler conditions. Yeah.
Plus the material is gonna create warmth itself, won't it?
Yeah, to a certain degree. Yeah. Yeah.
Not when it's like 30 below, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I think that the Biosphere Institute was doing vermicomposting workshops as well during COVID, but it might be worth reaching out to them to see if they have any materials or worms, and if they will be offering workshops again in the future. Yeah,
that's a good point, Lou. I forgot about the Biosphere.
Yeah,
I've heard they give some worms out for free.
Yeah. And then Barb, I think you had your hand up. Did you have a question, or was it answered there?
It was sort of answered, but I just had one other comment that I had heard, or question. If those worms for composting get in your garden, they can really destroy roots of plants. And is that true?
I've heard people say that, but it does not make any sense from the perspective that, again, like worms, even composting worms, they're not attracted to fresh plant material whatsoever. They're attracted to the decomposing microorganisms that grow on dead plant material. So
Oh, yeah. And then they won't live over in our climate anyway.
yeah, they're not hardy enough. Once it gets below zero, they'll die off, which just means soluble nutrients for the garden.
Yeah, I had heard that they could destroy a perennial border in no time.
Yeah, I've just, from everything I've studied about worms, I just can't, it doesn't make sense in my mind. I could be wrong, but
Oh, you probably have more experience than I do. I've never had worms.
yeah, I don't. Yeah, I've used a lot of vermicomposting in and around plants, and my only guess in terms of that, like I've heard people say that they applied a vermicompost and they had plants die. I maybe the quality of the vermicompost was like it went anaerobic, and it wasn't, when you apply anaerobic vermicompost, anaerobic anything around your plant roots, then the diseases are likely to be the factor.
And I was lucky enough to get a little bucket of
and that kind of
compost from Reed at the golf course. And it is absolute gardener's gold. It's beautiful stuff.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right on. I'm glad he's sharing it around.
Well, just a little bit. I think he uses a lot on the golf course.
Yeah. We've been using it as a divot replacer, and looking to add it to the backfill for the greens after they get aerated. And then related to this slide right here, we've made a whole bunch of extracts. So this is a small scale version of creating a compost extract. But we were doing it in a big 1,000 liter rain tote. And again, like you can see, we're immersing it in water. So this would be the high quality compost. And we're immersing it in water, but we have that aerator to make sure that we're keeping aerobic conditions. If there's one rule of thumb in botany and all of this, is it's always aerobic conditions for our plants and our plant roots. And I had a couple more slides. Actually, I'll just go to that. I think we'll end it here. I can finish up on the rest of the slides in the future. This is the soil food web rules, and I'll copy and paste this into the email that we'll share with all our participants. This comes from a book called Teaming with Microbes. Last class was inspired by Teaming with Nutrients. And so this is the other book in this series that Jeff Lowenfels wrote, that I really, really like and really recommend. So you can read a little bit more in that email about this, but I'll wrap it up because we're at an hour and a half right now. 2 hours. Oh my God.
Well, that was great. Time flies, Christian, when you're having fun. I'm always amazed at how much knowledge you have, and how you can just keep going and make it interesting. It's been great. Does anybody have any questions for Christian before we wrap it up here? Not seeing any. So Christian, you want to remind us what the next class is all about?
The next class, we are finally moving towards like real straightforward gardening best practices. We have set the table fully. I appreciate for everybody's patience. But yeah, we'll be talking about seed starting. We'll be talking about transplanting, bed prep, planting the garden. It's just going to be all practical talk about how to manage your garden. Now that we've talked very, very thoroughly about plants and soil.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in again. There's lots of thanks for you here, Christian, in the chat. So yeah, great job. And we'll see you all on Wednesday. Take care.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye,
Liz.
Christian.